Hello, it's Richard Pearce from FinextraTV, and this morning I'm joined by Michael Wilkins. Michael's Senior Research Fellow, Sustainable Finance at S&P Global Ratings, and he heads up their Environmental and Climate Research Unit. Good morning to you, Michael.
Good morning, Richard. How are you?
I'm very well. Lovely sunny day, so all is well. We're talking today, you've got a new paper out, which is Natural Capital and Biodiversity Reinforcing Nature as an Asset. We're doing obviously some work on this at Finextra, sustainablefinance.live, and so it's great context to hear from you about this today. And I was interested, one of the opening statements around the World Economic Forum says that half the world's GDP, or $44 trillion, is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. Yet later in the paper you say that there's a historical disconnect between investee companies addressing nature loss and the questions that investors are asking of investees. So tell me, why did you write this paper, and why now?
Well, why now? Well, biodiversity is increasingly becoming an issue on a par with climate change for policy makers and decision makers. And there's a growing concern that nature is both a function of our growing lexicon on climate change, and we believe the two are irrevocably linked. And the dramatic decline in nature we've witnessed over the last 50 years. For example, just to give you some flavor of that, 1 in 8 species are threatened with extinction. And this increases to 1 in 6 with a 4.3 degree warming trajectory, or business as usual scenario by 2100. So there's alarming declines across nature, with amphibians and species living in mountainous or Arctic regions particularly hard hit with nowhere to go. In the US and Canada, bird numbers have declined by 33% since 1970. Shark and ray populations have declined by 71% since 1970. And there's an 18-fold increase in fishing pressure. So there's just a few of the stats from our paper. So what does this mean? Well, the EU's 2030 biodiversity strategy, 30% of the EU's land and waters to be protected is what's being tackled here, plus the upcoming COP on biodiversity in October, we believe will largely set the tone on biodiversity becoming a prominent feature of discourse. And so we believe that climate change and biodiversity loss are interlinked, but solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are unlikely to benefit biodiversity in the same way. Instead, we believe that biodiversity needs to be given equal consideration in any nature-based climate solution offering. We also believe that the biodiversity crisis is still nascent ESG consideration for investors, but it is climbing up the agenda, which is a great thing. We also think that governments and companies are increasingly viewing the incorporation of natural capital into assessments of wealth and performance as fundamental to addressing biodiversity loss. And finally, and this is one of the key messages of the paper, that targeted corporates and government actions to reduce deforestation linked to soft commodities such as soy, beef, and palm oil will form a key part of the response, as well as supporting smallholder farmers and indigenous communities to protect nature. So those are kind of the key takeaways that we wanted to highlight in that paper.
Yeah, and it's really it's a good, easy read actually. Some quite difficult content to obviously to consider. Yeah. But you speak in there about you get into, I think, some quite good action-oriented approach, because there's a lot of headline papers around, but you get into some good action-oriented approaches. One of the things you talk about is natural capital accounting. And the role of the accountants to help us measure and manage this over and above just financial data. But of course, that's a long, slow process. It's taken us since the Great Depression to get to our GAP standards. Do you think that accounting is the way forward? Is it going to be quick enough for the crisis we have?
Well, we say in the paper that natural capital accounting is one piece of the puzzle. Albeit an important one. There are promising steps being made with agreeing on the framework to implement natural capital accounting, for example, as we've seen in New Zealand, which has formally dropped GDP as the measure or key measure of economic success. The intricacies of nature still make it effective pricing of it through ecosystem services a difficult one to achieve. So as the crisis is something that requires urgent action, there are some immediate things that can be taken. And so we've looked at terrestrial biodiversity loss in the white paper and found that about 50% of all terrestrial species are found in just 7.2% of global land areas, with the Amazon, for example, in southeastern Brazil and parts of Central Africa being the most notable biodiversity hotspots and the biggest areas of deforestation. And at about 70 to 80% of this deforestation, around 10 million hectares a year, is because of land expansion pressure to produce beef, soy, and palm oil, as I said previously. As such, we indicated there were potentially 4 solutions, particularly targeted at companies with agricultural supply chains. So, development of robust monitoring, know your grower, adopting universal standards, and using degraded land. So while natural capital is important and the accounting of natural capital is an important input into all this, there are some important actions that need to be taken on the ground to help arrest deforestation and biodiversity lost.
Thank you. That's really clear. So in there's one case study. I think it was highlighting JBS in the supply chain, and obviously the complexity of supply chains and the many layers that go across scope 1, 2, 3. A lot of the article talks about obviously the time it's going to take them to get a grip of that. It's complex, get that data available and obviously into their disclosures. And then even then it's not clear that it's going to actually make the outcomes happen as quick as we would look to have them addressed. So I don't want to be sort of the negative guy here, but how do we go about getting as many of these supply chains under control? What does this case study tell us?
I think what the case study on JBS tells us is that an agreement across all industry players is a must. And this agreement is likely best placed at the narrowest point in the supply chain, which is generally the traders. An agreement to stop deforestation through sourcing policies like NDPE, which stands for No Deforestation, Peat, or Exploitation, will go a long way, we think, to addressing the issue in a pragmatic way. So satellites can offer real-time assessment of deforestation in the supply chain. And as more companies utilize this technology, the greater the chances are of deforestation being curbed. But satellites are only good if the company knows the farm boundaries of all its suppliers, not just the direct suppliers, as the indirect suppliers are often more times the number of direct. Thus, money must also be spent on mapping an entire supply chain, on knowing your grower. Otherwise, the technological advancements are redundant to arresting deforestation and the biodiversity loss associated with that. And finally, paying for the conservation of nature is a must. We as consumers should be willing to pay a premium that could be passed on to farmers who are proactively aiding nature. And equally, poverty is a core driver of nature loss, and forced and child labor is part of that. If companies can agree to all paying a living wage, then the preservation of natural capital can actually be created. And a great example of that is cocoa, whereas an industry that is desperately in need of a collective effort to pay for higher wages, and it's been dragging its heels on solving the child labor issues for many years. So a first move on living wages in cocoa will help poorer financial performance.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think in the paper you also mentioned, there's a need to go beyond obviously stopping destruction of natural capital and associated social issues, but also to accelerate restoration. And in there again, there's another good case study around the Starry capital, which I thought was really constructive in that area. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's just one example that we highlight in the paper of the Starry Capital. It provides companies with a mechanism to invest in the conservation and restoration of nature by aggregating capital and deploying it to different projects. So as I said, this is just one of many examples which are now emerging in the capital markets, which show the innovation that can be used to try and solve this nascent issue.
Yeah, it's interesting. Quite a lot of the asset managers that we talk to, really say the problem is finding projects that are large enough that they can actually invest in, which given obviously the demand there is, coming from the conservationist organizations, seems unfathomable. But given this paper, what's the role of S&P, to ensure that disclosure data is not adding to greenwashing, but it is helping to solve the problems that you're clearly concerned about? So how does this all tie back, and what is the role of S&P in this?
Yeah, I mean, S&P Global and S&P Global Ratings, which is the division which I work in, we all rely on wide-scale, comparable, credible disclosure to help us do our analysis. So, when that's provided, then our analysis ultimately is better. When it's not provided, then we face difficulties like others do in the capital market. So, when we see initiatives such as the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which we're a part of, becoming much more widespread and slowly and surely becoming mandatory by the looks of it, then that we believe is going to be a major step forward. And on going back to natural capital, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure again will help in respect to nature disclosures as well, around the issues of natural capital inputs, which I talked about earlier, and also the linkages with things like biodiversity loss. So, and finally, disclosure is something that can be applied to, as I mentioned earlier, all areas, but in particular, in the case of what we've been looking at the paper, soft commodities and the companies that rely on them. So for investors, understanding which companies are proactive in addressing deforestation can allow for prudent and effective allocation of capital, and will come more into focus with the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures.
Yeah, very good. So let us know briefly, give us those 4 key actions again. You've said them through the course of the discussion, and where can people get access to the paper as well, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, what we suggested are 4 ways to mitigate or to help mitigate deforestation in soft commodity supply chains, around developing robust monitoring is the first one, potentially through satellites, knowing your grower, sort of making sure that smallholder farmers are supported. Thirdly, adopting universal standards to make sure everybody follows the same rule book. And finally, making sure that degraded land is used and not forgotten about. So that's just one proposal that we put forward in our white paper. If anybody's interested in accessing the white paper, just go to www.spglobal.com/ratings and go to the ESG Research and Insights page, and it'll be located there to download.
Fantastic. And if people are interested, join our workshop on this with Beth Burks from S&P, also WWF and a few others, which is May the 11th and 12th at sustainablefinance.live, and we'll be discussing these topics further. Michael, really appreciate you joining us today. Thanks for your time, and we look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you very much. Pleasure, Richard.